The last thing I told my nan, of course she didn't care about this, but I thought it was interesting to you, was that, you know, there's a paucity, or at least there was back in 1999 when the AIC really started its key research agenda on this. There was a paucity of policy-relevant Australian data. AIHW, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, runs the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. It started in 1995, but it doesn't survey incarcerated offenders. It doesn't survey people without a household. I know that might sound a bit silly, but we do have homeless people and we do have people who are using drugs and who are in very unstable accommodation situations. So household estimates of drug use that we get from these national surveys tend potentially to underestimate the extent of drug use in our community, because what they don't do is survey those parts of our society that of course are most likely to be using drugs, or at least that we know are most likely to be using drugs. The other point is that there were certainly a number of small-scale studies that had been conducted across Australia. And I've got some references there for anyone who is interested. And I've picked references that were relevant to the time, that kind of 1985 to 1999 period. But what I would say about those references is that at the end of the day, most were too small to have national relevance. So what we couldn't do is say anything about national drug use from those studies. Most used measures of drug use that were limited to a small number of drugs. So oftentimes it was heroin only. It was amphetamines, although back in those days amphetamines wasn't really necessarily a drug of keen interest. So they were focused on a very small and finite number of drugs. Few captured data about the nexus between drugs and crime, which has been increasingly of interest to a lot of our policymakers. And then finally, none could provide data that was responsive to changing drug markets. So a key limitation, for example, of the National Drug Strategy Household Survey is that it runs every 3 years, but we know what actually happens in terms of drug use can actually be quite variable in a short period of time, and that these much larger studies, although indeed they were interesting and useful, were conducted so far apart that it was almost difficult for us to be able to monitor what was going on in a short space of time. And finally, although I think I said finally on the last slide, but I'm saying finally now, what happened from 1999 onwards was that actually there was a great deal of investment from a policy perspective in the issue of drugs and drug-related crime and drug-related offenders who were committing crime. We had the Commonwealth Department of Health and Ageing establish the Police Drug Diversion, or otherwise known as the PDDI initiative, which is a program that's aimed at diverting juvenile or young offenders who are in custody or have been brought to the attention of the police for their very first drug offence to be diverted away from court proceedings and into some kind of education or cautioning scheme. The second are the intermediate diversionary courts, like those that operate under the merit banner, and there are almost one in every jurisdiction of those particular types of courts. We had drug courts come out in 1999 in Sydney, and then followed by Queensland and Victoria, and then over to WA. And then finally we had a whole range of new programs being implemented at a custodial and non-custodial level by departments of corrections that were aimed at trying to treat drug-dependent offenders so as to prevent them from becoming re-engaged with the criminal justice system. All of these initiatives meant that we had an explosion of policymakers, we had an explosion of practitioners on the ground who needed information that couldn't have otherwise been provided without more detailed and better data collection. Which leads me then into what the AIC has been doing since 1999. And this is just a brief overview of the number of projects that we've been doing, and isn't necessarily exhaustive, but gives you a broad sense of what in fact we've been doing over that period of time. The Drug Use Monitoring in Australia project, which I'll go into more detail in a second. The Drug Use Careers of Offenders project, which was the prisoner study that we conducted much earlier on. Drug courts evaluations, the AIC has been involved in evaluating the Queensland Drug Court, the Performance Measurement Framework for Drug Law Enforcement, which I know Adam mentioned in his earlier presentation today. The Police Drug Diversion, or the PDDI program I mentioned earlier, was an evaluation that the AIC also conducted. And at the moment we're currently, as Matthew mentioned in his talk earlier this morning, doing a lot around Indigenous substance abuse and policing. So we've got a whole range of projects that are alcohol and drug related projects, and that, as I mentioned, is really about increasing our understanding of what's going on at a local and a national level, so that we can inform and feed back policy relevant information to those people who are on the ground as practitioners. A somewhat different goal to academic research. Putting my PhD cap on now, of course that's completely not about any of this, and is about kind of testing theory and doing all those sorts of things. But mainly our research at the AIC is about trying to provide that finite information that is usable to the people on the ground who are our practitioners. So the Drug Use Monitoring in Australia project is one of our flagship projects. It's been operating since 1999. The sample is of criminal offenders detained by the police for no longer than 48 hours. The reason why we don't survey detainees who have been in custody for longer than 48 hours is because we collect a urine sample and we test that to see whether or not someone has actually been recently using drugs. And I don't know how much of you know, but drugs don't actually take that long to leave the system. You usually have about a window of 48 hours in order to assure a positive test after use. So to make sure that our self-report data and our urinalysis data actually matches up, we need only to survey those who have been in custody for 48 hours. We survey in pretty much every state and territory across Australia, in New South Wales, Bankstown, Parramatta and Kings Cross, in East Perth in WA, in Queensland, in Brisbane and Southport, in South Australia, Adelaide and Elizabeth, although the Elizabeth site of collection has actually ceased. In Victoria we survey in Footscray, in the Northern Territory we survey in Darwin City. The methodology is in effect a voluntary self-report survey and a urinalysis. Now the AIC doesn't actually do the surveys themselves, thank God, because that would mean sitting in police stations right around Australia for the better part of our lives, collecting that information and asking for a urine. What we do is we contract that out to professional research services on the ground, and they administer the survey and collect the urine and send it off to a laboratory in New South Wales on behalf of the AIC, and that data then comes back to us for collation and analysis. And the current status, just for your information, is that, as I said, the program's been operating since 1999. It runs quarterly, so we collect the data every quarter. And since 1999, we've surveyed 39,105 police detainees, and we've collected 30,463 urine specimens and tested them over that period of time. Quite a huge sample size for anyone who's currently thinking about methodology and statistical analysis in their PhDs or otherwise, or in their other studies. So it's a fairly large project, and each year the sample is roughly about 4,000.